I will remind you all, as yesterday, that since we are recording, if you do not wish to be on the recording, you should drop questions in chat until after we stop recording. And welcome to today's Fast Start workshop. Today, we are going to talk in some detail about data management plans as documents and how you can do an effective job of creating them. And our objectives for today are basically to try and talk a little bit about the importance of data management planning and data sharing. I believe most of you attended yesterday's workshop. So if by some chance you were not at yesterday's workshop, I would really appreciate it if you would drop that in the chat, because some of this I will skim over in the interest of A, time, and B, not boring some of our attendees that heard it all yesterday. And so I need to know if there's anybody I will leave in the dust. And then the next thing, we will look at the components of a written data management plan. And probably the most important thing is that we will, I'm going to spend a lot of time just pointing you to resources, because there are lots of them. And depending on what you're trying to write a data management plan on, it can be extremely helpful to find someone in your area who can give you some good guidance. Okay, so introductions. Yesterday, I asked you if you would to drop your area and in other words, your discipline and your status. If you are a faculty or if you are a grad student, would you mind putting that into the chat? Kind of helps other people see, who else is in the workshop, and it helps me a little bit, again, know how to focus some of these things. And then we will look at these things on the agenda. Why are we creating a data management plan, frequently referred to as a DMP? And we'll talk again about the DMP as a process that I went into a lot yesterday. Talk about how it should be linked in with workflows and protocols, and why it's an important open science tool. Then we'll look at ways to create our DMP as a document and 10 rules for creating those DMPs. So start with why create a data management plan. And again, yesterday we talked a lot about this, but better research results from better research processes. In other words, managing your data makes it easier to find data when you need it, interpret data, not just you, but others who are working on your project or those you need to communicate with after the project. Funders expected. We talked about that a bit yesterday. We'll talk about it a little more today. It supports open science, and we'll talk about why that's so important. And accessible data increases citations for publications. There is some research that indicates this. So it can be a little self-serving. Think about, creating data management plans and putting your data out there actually can result in more citations for the work you publish. It's important for better onboarding when you bring people into a lab or into your project. Having your data well managed and lots of documentation makes this so much easier for other people and less time consuming for you if you are the PI. And probably the most important for our purposes today is to think about better funding proposals. So one thing I want you to think about before we get started here is that a DMP, isn't just sent off into a black hole. DMPs are really important for a lot of stakeholders. And so this little diagram here, which comes from our 10 principles for machine actionable data management plans, and we'll look at that in a little more detail, but it points out that in addition to the funder, the person you're actually submitting the proposal to and the DMP, that this is a document that can be really important for things like ethics review, which is your IRB, maybe your research misconduct office, depending on their level of participation in the process. Legal expert might be like your IP office, people like that. Researchers, obviously, other people on the project need to know how the data is going to be managed. Once you're to the point of publishing, then the data management plan can be used to facilitate where the data is stored and how it's made available. Repository operator, we talked about that at some length yesterday. And then I'll be honest and tell you, infrastructure provider eludes me a little bit, but research support staff, that's your folks who maybe do the data or the analysis, in your, perhaps you have, other offices that you work with to do data analysis or do analytical lab work or that kind of thing. And then finally, institutional administrator refers to your grants office, research sponsored programs, that kind of thing. So all of these people should be people that you keep in mind when you are creating a DMP. So just to bring this to your attention, some of the things that DMPs do is, as we've said, help you follow good data management practices, ensure data integrity, prevent data loss, increase transparency and enable data reuse, and help promote your proposal. Here's some things that they do not do. In spite of people's knee-jerk reactions, they do not require that you share all your data with anybody who requests it. Open data does not mean that you're just putting it out there for the entire world with no restrictions and no guidance. Another thing they do not do is they do not update themselves. This is really important. DMPs are increasingly expected to become or to be treated as living documents, evergreen documents. Those are things that are meant to be updated to reflect the current actual practices of your research. And the other thing, and this one comes from personal experience, they do not work best when they are thrown together just before your proposal is submitted. So as the data librarian, sadly, I've had way too many experiences where people contacted me with 24 hours left before they have to submit their proposal and want to know, how to do a DMP. So a lot of what we're trying to do here is have you all get off on a good foot and make sure that your research is well planned and your data is well managed right from the beginning. So one of the things that I really wanted to mention in this workshop, because it's so timely, is if you have reason to expect that you will be either have NIH funding or trying to submit proposals for NIH funding, you need to be aware of a change in the NIH policy for data management and sharing. And so NIH has really always been kind of at the forefront of this. And part of it is because of the nature of the work that NIH funds. As we all experienced with COVID, it can be incredibly valuable and important work for the public good. And it can be so important in terms of timely research. So getting data out there for other scientists is a critical priority of NIH. So you notice here, this policy was originally published, I guess is the word, in October of 2020. for public comment, and it is now finalized and will be effective January 25th of 2023. That is the beginning of the next round of proposal submissions for NIH. So there's a link down here. You can learn lots more about it at these links. Just to highlight a couple of things, it requires submission of a data management and sharing plan, which outlines how your scientific data will be managed and shared, and it clearly states taking into account any potential restrictions or limitations. So again, if you're using personally identifiable information as part of your research, NIH understands that you're not going to be able to just do a dump of that data, and that it will have to be managed appropriately so that the things that need to be confidential remain confidential. And it may also require compliance with the NIH program officer approved plan, and NIH has some cases where they have special requirements. So a couple of other things I'll mention is that in the past, NIH, before this is implemented, NIH only required data sharing plans for grants that were above $500,000. And this changes that. It now no longer matters what size the grant is. It also, and let's see, I think I actually should move to the next slide. It also actually implies that the data must be shared at the time of publication or at the end of the grant period. And, with the exceptions mentioned in the data management sharing plan, that is also a change. So they're not just encouraging timely publication, they've actually put a very well-defined limit on it. So these are the elements of the NIH data management and sharing plan, and we'll look into that a little more. The links here also, you can go take a look at what allowable costs for data management and sharing are, and we'll talk about that a little more. And they provide significant guidance around selecting repositories. So yesterday we talked about the disciplinary or domain-specific repositories versus generalist, and that is one of the things that NIH provides very strong guidance on. Their preferences for domain-specific. If that's not practical or possible, you may select a generalist repository. And so, yeah, these links will take you to some of the specifics about that. Okay, another thing to be aware of is, I mentioned this yesterday as well, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation this is an example. There are many private funding agencies that also require open access and open data. And you notice here, this is clearly stated in their open access policy, and they do require that publications be published in open access journals. They will help with processing charges and fees. So that is a good thing. All right, and then planning for open science. Okay, I'm gonna go into this in a little more detail than I did yesterday. So the movement to open science is in large part the result of what is called the reproducibility crisis, which is simply that people have, through the course of time, especially as things have been moved online and data has been made more open, people have discovered that just because you, first of all, say your data is open and available does not make it so. And so, we, as an open science movement, are trying to make sure that data truly is available. The next thing is that when that data is used to try, reproduce the results of a study in a appallingly large percentage of cases, it's found that the work is not reproducible. And so that is where the reproducibility crisis comes from. So a lot of the emphasis on open science is to make it more transparent and make it possible for people to come along behind the original published work and go into it and look at it. First of all, can we reproduce what the work as it was done? And can we then take that data and apply it to a broader scope of work and help emphasize the or validate that particular scope of work? So one of the things that has come out of this is what are called FAIR principles. And FAIR is an acronym. It stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I have up in the corner here a link to the Go FAIR organization, which provides training materials and more in-depth explanations about this and how to make your data fair. So again, please feel free to go to that source for additional information if you are not familiar with this. But just as a high-level explanation, findable is exactly what it sounds like. It means, is your data in a place that it can be discovered? Can it be, is it can it be found? Does it have a permanent identifier? Is it searchable? Accessible means it really needs to be in a repository or a location where it's free and can be downloaded with minimal costs or barriers. Interoperable gets a little trickier. And here, what we're talking about is using metadata and perhaps a controlled vocabulary and so on in such a way that the data set as you download it can actually be synced or intertwined or used with data from another source to create a large combined data set. Because if the descriptions, the structure, the everything from even units, variables, and so on are not able to be combined to create a coherent set, it doesn't help you much, okay? And then that takes us to reusable, where metadata meets domain relevant standards, and that makes for easy data reuse. Again, there is a 2019 resource down there at the bottom to give you some more information on that, as well as the Go FAIR link. All right, let's talk about DMP as a process. Basically, what you're looking at here is trying to use a data management plan as a big picture document that captures information about your data in every step of the data lifecycle. Okay, so those of you that were here yesterday, you remember the data lifecycle didn't look quite like this, and that's because the one I showed you yesterday was actually created for purposes of a repository, ICPSR. And this one is the product of data one, and it reflects the researcher's perspective. So you still start up here with plan, and that plan step is intended to incorporate all the steps of the life cycle, okay? So start there and then think through each one of these steps as you create your DMP. So just as a review, I mean, the plan can be the step before you even submit your proposal, should be before you even submit your proposal. Collect is where you begin the process of data collection. Assure is a quality assurance process where you check and be sure that data is meaningful. Describe is where you're creating metadata. Preserve is where it goes to the repository. Okay, so now we have additional steps that incorporate the open data. So you go looking for additional data. That's the discover step. Integrate, put them all together to create a single data set, analyze. So obviously, many projects only incorporate a few of these steps. Not all steps are appropriate for all research projects. And like we discussed yesterday, it's also quite common that this is not a nice circular process. There will be steps going on simultaneously and some that have to be repeated because that's how research works. All right, this is intended to show that messy process and ask, how is it that we consider a DMP when we're looking at workflows? So the top box there, A, shows that, abbreviated research data lifecycle, where you're formulating your ideas and acquiring data, analyzing, publishing, and disseminating findings. And then down below are all the different places where workflows may exist. And so, again, this is a thought process. So go into your DMP, having thought through how these things link together in such a way that when you create the DMP, you're able to include the details in the DMP. It's important to organize your data with the protocols that are associated and make sure they're accessible to everybody that needs them. And also, I yet again mentioned the importance of encouraging regularly updating documentation. And it's important to be sure that everyone involved in the project knows that they should be doing that. So I want to mention this. This is an OSF template, and it came from one created by Johns Hopkins University librarians, but we have it templated for use with the OSU grant associated with it. And the link down here at the bottom can go into your, Danny, or let's see, would you mind typing that in? It's not horrible. Into the chat if there's somebody there. But you can see it's just set up with an organization of layers with the different parts of organizing a research project. And so data management plans there at the top, and I'll show you that again here in a while. And I want to mention machine actionable DMPs. This is something that is like a perfect universe. If you have a machine actionable DMP, you have basically, and it's completely machine actionable, then you are able to be assured that the updating and reporting is being done through automation. Most DMPs are not. And so you see that quote from this paper. It says the current manifestation of a DMP. Okay, that one didn't work. All right, I'll chase that down here in a bit. Is a static document, and it only contributes to the perception that DMPs are an annoying administrative exercise. So by automating as much as possible, it's obviously going to be more useful, and it's going to be more useful to all those stakeholders that I mentioned. So if we look over here at the steps, integrating DMPs into the workflows, which we've already mentioned, and make policies for machines, they also need to be human readable. But again, setting up policies. Now, by policies, I'm meaning things like, requiring the DMPs be sent to the research office. And then they are helpful by sending it back and saying it's time to do an annual report. And so it's time to update your DMP, that kind of thing. Okay, describing the components using the PIDs, which is the persistent identifiers, in as many places as possible. Looking for a common data model, making sure, again, all the data collected for your project is consistent in ways that matter, and so on. And then making them publicly available. Okay, let's look at DMP as a document. All right, well, so a few things to understand is that DMPs vary between agencies, not a lot, but I would say in particular, some of the things that vary is the formatting. And obviously some agencies have very specific requirements that other agencies do not. So it's important to look up the DMP requirements in as early as possible. If you're, you're submitting a grant proposal, first place to go is your solicitation and look and see what it says. Another thing that is, I see this over and over, is consult the program officer early and often. And so this is something that I think maybe a lot of researchers, especially at the beginning, are perhaps a little hesitant to do. But that's what they're there for. They're there to guide you, and they can provide you with guidance on the things that are of greatest importance for their area, their proposal. Okay, so the next thing is I want to share the, okay, to find it first, the DMP tool. All right, so online tools can be incredibly helpful with this. And so I mentioned two of them here. DMP tool is the one I'd recommend because it's US based, but DMP Online is UK based. So depending again on your work, your collaborators and so on, you may want to look into it. And so this is what DMP tool looks like. And OSU is a partner. So one of the things that you should know is that you are, okay, I'm already signed in from earlier. So OSU maintains, you can search by OSU. In other words, if there is a grant that you are aware of that has, was submitted from OSU, you can search it. Now, a problem with that is, as you see here, very few of them are public. I've created a few fake ones to look at just for purposes of our workshops. But before I do that, I'm going to show you about how to search for a DMP that is useful for your area. So go to the public DMPs up here and you can search. This is your search box. You can also go here and say, okay, I'm going to look for the a particular institution. And this might be an institution that, so like USGS here, we used USGS yesterday as an example. So you might be interested in submitting a proposal to USGS. They also have, guidance here. So that's one way to go about it. Another way is, and probably more useful, is to go in and do it by subject or by, so if you're looking at earth sciences, you can do it that way. You can also, try and submit. I have not tried this, so I don't know how successful it would be, but try and use keywords or something of the sort. okay, to find public DMPs. Now, one thing I will mention is I have found from a few past searches, because they're public doesn't guarantee they're good. So keep that in mind. It's one way to get some useful information, but it may not be the only way you should reference. Okay, so just for fun, let's go down here. This is one that was put together for a proposal that was submitted but not funded. It went to the NSF Biological Sciences. And so let's take a look at that just to show you what the form looks like. Okay, so first we have the name of the project up here. We have collaborators. So any, you can invite collaborators to contribute. This is where you write your plan, and you see that it's got the different components that are required by that agency. And then some additional anticipated research outputs. And then when you're finished with it, you're able to download it as a PDF or any of these other formats. And you can dictate what you want it to look like, okay? And then finalize and publish, okay? And here's where you set the visibility. Okay, and this is a really good point, which I would have forgotten, but again, after you put the work into creating this can be added to your ORCID. And so it's a research product, and it's useful for others to have a better understanding of the work you do. Okay, so on the page here, I want to also show you another thing, select guidance. So one thing you are able to do, you can select up to 6 organizations to see their guidance. So let's look at that. All right, so this is our list, and depending on the kind of proposal you're writing, it may be that you know that, well, okay, Iowa State, for instance, does a lot of this kind of work. It's an ag proposal. So I'm gonna select Iowa State. I'm gonna select Texas A&M, and because I know that's the kind of work a lot of their research is done in, and so let's go with that. And so it adds them to my list here, and then I save. And now, as I am filling this out, I can go in and see, let's go into the right plan and see what it is that they recommend, okay? So here's the first field, data and materials produced, and it tells us just the basics. What are the types of data, physical samples, et cetera, and cover all the various data types being collected by each collaborator. Okay, and so we start with, first of all, because this is an NSF proposal, which kind of doesn't line up with my ag thing, but bear with me. So it shows me what guidance is available from NSF, okay? So it'll take you to those policies. Now let's see what Iowa State says. Yeah, not much, okay. Or maybe it does, hang on. Oh, it does, okay. So it reminds you about including metadata and metadata schemas, being specific about which ones you're using. And then go to the DMP tool description. So you see what this does. It just adds in additional guidance that you can use to feel more confident about the information that you enter. And each one of these has that, okay? Looks like Texas A&M had nothing for the first field, but it does for this. So, we can see what they suggest, all right? So that's another really helpful thing about DMP tool. And finally, this is persistent, it doesn't go away, it's saved in the cloud. And so if you expect that you will be applying for grants from the same organization, over and over potentially, then that's useful because you can adapt and improve as you go. One last thing, even though you may have a tendency to fall back and kind of boilerplate these things, it's a really good idea to revisit it and check for changed funder requirements and see if there's ways to improve it every time you submit, unless you get funded the first time, in which case, good for you and carry on. It looks like you did a good job. All right, this is just an overview of the type of data to be collected and what it should, how you should describe that in a DMP. A lot of this stuff was mentioned on the dmptool.org. And so file formats, non-proprietary or better. How are you going to organize it? Okay, do you have software tools, spreadsheets, databases, or that kind of thing? What kind of software and programming costs you might need to account for? Versioning and persistent identifiers are really important. All right, metadata or data documentation. Let me check the time here, see how we're doing. Okay. What information is necessary to understand the data? And we talked about this at some length yesterday. So you should think about this on several levels. You should start with, even lab level or group level, certain procedures should be consistent and standard. That's part of it. If it applies to data management, you want to include that. Project level, we talked about creating a README text file. And this is just where you document what are all the things you do with your data. And then data level, as much as possible, embed it in your data files. Include all the things like descriptions of variables and formats and that kind of thing. And your metadata should be machine readable. So we go back to that machine actionable DMP. Determine whether a disciplinary or community standard metadata schema is available. Okay, again, up front, go looking within your own community standards to see what is available, because it is a headache to have to go back and reassign variables and rename things. And so much better to do this up front. I've shown a Dublin Core metadata generator. There are a lot of disciplines where you will not find a metadata standard or schema that is appropriate. And so you may have to work with something like Dublin Core, which is high level and kind of universal. So that link, it will take you to some information about using Dublin Core and how to generate it for yours. And finally, I mentioned creating metadata at the data level. There are a lot of, I won't say a lot, let me say there are software programs available that can help do that. And so you'll want to investigate that. All right, this is an example, and I wanted to share this with you. This is actually a project. You can see the citation down below. Tyson Oxner and collaborators. It's about determining soil moisture patterns using sensors. It's a very big data project, so it is run through our OSU High Performance Computing Center, and they helped partner to create the data collection interface. Again, a useful thing to be aware of if you might be looking ahead at a big data project. And what they did is they set up the automated metadata collection so that it is embedded in the file headers. So let me show you real quickly. First of all, the first thing they did was use the ESIP is a Earth Science Information Partners, I believe is the acronym. And it's a community that creates the vocabularies, and so here we have, they recommend formats in the ISO 8601 for dates and times that I mentioned yesterday. And this is all the information about their suggested metadata and documentation. Okay. And then the other thing that that was used is from a group, Net CDF, Climate Data Forecast Metadata Convention. So here's where they came up with the naming conventions and the different components. This is where the actual metadata for, I think this was for the climate data, and the other is for other parts of the data. But anyway, they this was the pre-planned metadata standards that were used for this project. And then I wanted to show you the, I can't actually access the data set that I had linked there. Should have looked at that earlier before I started putting these slides together, but I thought I would share the GitHub repo where this is saved. And there is some information here about the, so this is a Python file, and yeah, so this is where the data is saved, and this is a, has the advantage of being versioned and organized and publicly accessible. So this meets all the criteria for good data management. All right, let's talk about QA/QC of data. We talked yesterday about creating and using templates, very important, and really, again, upfront, easy to do, minimize your manual data entry, you minimize errors. You should always check for completeness and do random sample checks if you need to do some deep dives. And that's a good, another good thing to set up a schedule for. When are you going to just select some files at random and go in and check and be sure that nothing's gotten corrupted in either the data storage or the collection process or any of that. Sometimes redundant data entry is one answer. So for instance, if you do collect data on a paper form, for instance, you might scan it as well as, OCR it into an Excel sheet or something like that, retain the data, the original paper data files. It's a very good way of allowing for, backtracking to check when something's not going well. Use software to check for outliers and entry errors. We offer workshops on OpenRefine. You can use Excel functions whenever possible. Again, automate so that the QA/QC is done without you having to manually go in and do it. Another important thing for project management and communication, create rules for how to handle and document errors. So when there is an error discovered in some data, it needs to be documented so that others know, if there's a chance that they used the wrong data or they come in and find something funky, there's, it's not hard to find out what went wrong. And then you need a data preservation strategy. One of the things that's frankly the hardest to figure out is how long do you need this data to be accessible? Not all of it has to be available forever. And a lot of researchers, frankly, have a hoarding gene. And it's once you generate this data, it's really hard to turn loose of it. And I totally get that. But resources get limited, storage gets limited, and frankly, the bigger your storage database, et cetera, is, the harder it is to search things. So it's a really good idea to be systematic. Okay, storage options during the project. Again, we talked about this at some length yesterday, but everything from local computers, cloud platforms, and so on are, will probably play a role throughout the project. And depending on the size of the data that you're collecting, who your collaborators are, and so on, that will impact which of those you choose, how much capacity do you need. And I mentioned yesterday the importance of backup. I didn't mention the rule of three. Basically, the rule of three says you should always have three copies of all your data. 2 of them may be on site, but in different locations and different devices. 1 may be in the cloud, or it may be off-site, again, depending on your data. Long-term storage and archiving, we talked about that at quite a bit of length yesterday. Generalist repositories such as Dryad and Figshare, institutional repository, ShareOK, I mentioned, is not a data repository as such. They are beginning to accept fairly small data sets. It needs to be well organized. You need to approach them first. My own recommendation is that you save your data elsewhere. And in a repository that has a persistent identifier, such as a DOI, save the DOI and an explanation with the documents and publications in ShareOK, so that people can find that through searching and then go to the data in a data repository. And I mentioned yesterday about using re3data.org to locate a repository. So it's a searchable function that allows you to find a repository if you're having a hard time finding one. Okay, project data policies, and this is just information you need for or to be aware of when you are deciding how to make it public and so on. Licensing. Again, remember that the best thing is to make at least some published version of your data public, available with the minimal barriers. And so CC BY just says, put it out there and please give me attribution, but you're welcome to use it any way you want to. There are other levels that include additional restrictions, but please default to the least restrictive one that you can actually get by with. Sharing arrangements for pre-existing materials. So there are things called data sharing agreements, and this is, if someone wants to, if you want to use someone else's materials, they may ask you to sign a sharing, data sharing agreement. You should be aware of them in case you want to make the non-public portion of your data available to someone who has need for, raw data or something like that. These are one way to make that possible. All of these things are things that you should mention in your DMP. So any intellectual property issues, embargo, code, etc. You'll need to be aware of export control regulations, which basically means if you are going to consider sharing your data with someone in another country, you need to be aware that you can't do that universally. There are some restrictions. Sensitive data should go through the IRB, and as much as possible, again, make it widely available at the time of publication. Okay, availability. So again, this just, kind of reiterates that. You'll need to consult your journal guidelines. Some journals, especially open access journals, have restrictions and guidelines around data publication. And yeah, mention the CC BY there, and repeat as few restrictions as possible. Roles and responsibilities. This is something else that needs to be spelled out in a DMP. Who does what? And as I mentioned yesterday, remember that if you do not dictate who's going to do it, no one will do it, or you will discover belatedly that that was a gap. Large projects, you may actually need to have a dedicated data scientist, and that would be included in the budget. You would need to include so many FTEs for someone to use their time expressly for managing, analyzing the data from the project. And again, update the DMP often. Okay, here we come to the budget. And this is not as such in the DMP, but be aware that many proposals allow you to budget for data management costs. So when you are looking at things that cost money, whether it's a data curation service, a fee for a repository, so I mentioned the automating software, that kind of thing, are all things that you can include in your proposal budget. And so that can be mentioned in the DMP as well. All right, I've got one more example here. And I know that, let's see, back. This is I kind of put this in here as an example of the fact that even though most DMPs are restricted to 2 pages, and it feels like after we've been through all that very long list of things that should be included in a DMP, that's way too much to include in a 2-page document. So I have this shown here mostly to point out to you, this is for a very large multidisciplinary NSF-funded project. And you see that they are able to provide a lot of detail in here, and have a section for each one of the components that must be included, and still keep it under 2 pages. Now it's single spaced, and I don't know what the font size is there, but they got it in there. So it really is possible, and so I encourage you to include as much detail as you can. Finally, I've included these as a resource. This is taken from Johns Hopkins Library has again, a wealth of information on data services of all kinds. And so I've included the URL there for the library and their data services. And this is the component for the Johns Hopkins electronic lab notebook that I mentioned for the DMP. So Danny, you might be able to drop that one in there. Anyway, this is a checklist, and it looked like a great resource for, it's really out there for a grant reviewer's purposes, but of course, if you're submitting one, knowing what the reviewer is going to look at is also very, very helpful. So I encourage you to go. It's actually multi-pages. I think it's at least 5 pages long. So I didn't include it here, but just to make you aware of it. And then this is my list of must-have resources. And the other thing I will encourage you to do is consider that, don't underestimate the resources that are out there that you can search through Google, through anything. Just if you have a question that has not been answered by this presentation, any of those resources that I described, there is so much out there. I'm certain that a good Google search will put you on the right track. So this is my my final say here, which is just that, I hope today that we have managed to convince you to take a lot of this to heart and do the planning before you begin doing any research, because you can prevent yourself a lot of headaches. So with that, I will stop talking. And if anyone has, let's see how we've got 2 minutes. Okay, for questions, please feel free to unmute or to put it in the chat. and I am more than happy to answer them. I will follow up with an email if you weren't able or didn't download the slides today. You'll be able to download them when you receive the follow-up email, and there will be a link to this workshop recording. So thank you so much for your participation. And stop sharing. Okay. Anybody unmute? We can stop recording. Danny, thank you.